Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Husch Blackwell Energy and Natural Resources webinar. This is going to be a webinar on our currently ongoing Texas legislative session, and we're going to have a discussion today here over lunch over a lot of the important bills that we've been following for clients and for others. We're going to focus on those bills and hopefully, give y'all some perspective and some additional information for your use in your work and your activities in the industry. I'm Chris Reeder. I'm a partner in the Husch Energy and Natural Resources group, and I focus primarily on Texas energy regulatory matters. That's both in terms of the Public Utility Commission and then helping to support our transactional and our power development practice. Before we get into the content, I want to talk about a few housekeeping type items. At the bottom of your audience console, there's multiple application icons that you can use during our program. The most important of which is if you have any questions, please submit those using the question box. We're going to try to reserve time towards the end to address your questions. But if there's if your question requires kind of a fuller answer than we're able to get to, we're going to try and get back to you later after we're done. So we want to make sure that you're able to interact with us via the question function. We're going to have a PDF of our presentation. That'll be in the program materials folder, so you'll be able to get the slides. We've been approved for continuing legal education credits for y'all who are attending live. You can report your hours using the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen, and you'll get a certificate of attendance, including course numbers, emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webinar, which I know you'll want to listen to many, many times. And then towards the end of the program, we really hope that you'll fill out the survey. There's a survey icon that you can push. We use the results from that to determine, what future webinars we may want to have, or other of our blog content or other, thought pieces that we try to get out. We want to be responsive to what people are interested in. Okay, that's all the housekeeping items. So I would suspect that many of you aren't necessarily all that familiar with the Husch Blackwell firm. So if you'll just allow me 1 minute to kind of talk about our practice. We have an active, both national and state level energy regulatory practice. Elena, Holly, and myself are part of the Texas group, and we routinely advocate before the PUC, a few blocks up the street from where we are, on all manner of issues, compliance issues, enforcement investigations, relief for various types of regulatory treatments that clients want. We also, as I indicated, we provide regulatory support in our group's transactional practice. So M&A transactions, financings, investments, things of that nature. We provide the regulatory support that goes into those types of transactions. You're seeing half of our team. We also have out of our Austin office, Carrie Collier Brown and Dakota Parrish. Many of y'all may have worked with at some point or another, as well as Chris Hughes. So that's the team, and that's our practice in Texas. And as I said, we have a national practice, and I have many other colleagues in several of our other offices. Why are we doing this? We, like probably many of you, have been getting just a ton of questions about this current Texas legislative session. We have been following it very closely. We are not lobbyists. I don't have the Speaker of the House on my speed dial, not yet. But as I say, we're very closely monitoring what's happening, and we are interactive with most of the key players and have various perspectives. And so we get asked a lot about what's happening and where are things going. And given the volume of interest, we thought this would be a good subject to have a webinar about and just share kind of our perspectives. We're going to work through an overview of what we're seeing as kind of the key legislation this time around. And as I said, we want to reserve some time at the end for questioning. Remember, none of this is legal advice. This is just a friends of Husch Blackwell telling you what we think about things, but we hope that it will be of some use to you as well, and look forward to working through our points. So it's often said no one's life, liberty, or property are safe when the legislature is in session, and this time around it's no different. With energy, it seems like things never stop. There used to be a time when they just didn't do much on energy. Those days are past us. It's an exceptional amount of legislation this time around, just like last time. And so we're going to work through what we think are the key bills. We're going to talk about ones, principally ones that have been moving. There have been a lot more that have been filed, but really haven't been working through the process that much. So we're only going to focus on the ones that appear to have some legs. For those who aren't necessarily all that familiar with the Texas Legislature, let me just say it's a weird and wonderful environment, but not unlike Schoolhouse Rock. It's not too different than that. They meet every other year for 140 days. This session began January the 14th. It ends on June the 2nd. The governor has until June the 22nd to veto bills or to allow them to become law either by signature or not vetoing them. We're a little more than halfway through, but we're now kind of entering the phase where things get really tight, and deadlines become compressed, and tempers get a little bit on edge, and people get very antsy. So the cool part of the session for those who hang around a lot, our legislature is plenary, meaning that it can take on any subject that is within fair bounds for a state to cover. It is a regular legislative session, so they're not restricted as to what they can take up the way they would be in a special session that a governor might call after the conclusion of the regular session. To pass the legislature, a bill must pass in the exact same form in both the Senate and the House. So a Senate bill, the Senate has to approve it, and the House has to approve the exact same bill that the Senate approved, and vice versa. If one body passes a bill but in a slightly different form, or maybe substantially different form than the other body does, then either one of them have to yield to the other, or they have to appoint a conference committee to resolve their differences. Bills generally go through a committee process, meaning that they're filed. They come up for a hearing in the relevant committee. The committee, if the committee approves it, then it goes to the full Senate or the full House. And then if there's a majority vote or a 5/9 vote in the Texas Senate, then it can be passed and move on to the other body. And so that's sort of the way that things work. And as I said, we're starting to come up on the time where things start moving a little more quickly. And so we're seeing more movement on some of these bills. Let me introduce our speakers after that kind of introduction. We have with us Elena Zermino and Holly Heinrich. Elena is a senior counsel in our Austin office, and prior to coming on with Husch, she was an assistant staff attorney at the Public Utility Commission, and she worked principally in the Office of Oversight and Enforcement of the Legal Division of the PUC, and had a lot of responsibility for enforcement and investigations and things of that matter. Since coming with us, Elena's been very active on the regulatory front, both in terms of back over at the PUC and also, as I said, supporting a lot of our deal practice. Holly is an associate who recently came to us from ERCOT and represents, helps us on supporting our work for, a variety of energy clients, generation companies, developers, investors, lenders, retail electric providers, even some transmission type entities and large load companies that are trying to seek interconnection, along with 50 million other of their friends as well. And before that, Holly was an attorney with the city of Austin and also worked on a variety of city of Austin utility issues. So with that, let's now turn to content. And Holly, if I can ask you to just kind of introduce the basic major themes of energy legislation this session.
Absolutely. You know, I think one thing that is interesting, we've sort of moved on from a lot of the most intensive of the Winter Storm Uri legislation, the post-Winter Storm Uri legislation. And so I think what I see as some of the hot topics in the legislature right now are large load interconnection, that we're having so many large loads interconnecting and still seeking to interconnect with the Texas grid, data centers, crypto mines, AI, hyperscalers. And so that's an area where, both the legislature, but also the PUC and ERCOT are really looking to define the large load interconnection process, create some more kind of predictability and more parameters around that. ERCOT recently just approved a MPRR 1234 and PIGR 115 to better define that process, and that's going to the PUC next for approval. And so we're seeing the legislature really look at that as well. The other thing that's really a hot topic at the moment is we're seeing a lot of bills that are really seeking to specifically regulate wind, solar, and batteries in a way that maybe is a little different, and that is specifically focused on those resources as opposed to just resources in general in the ERCOT market. So that's another key feature of this legislative session.
Okay, thanks. And Elena, we have up on the screen key bills to watch if you want to take a stab at kind of walking through those just on a high level basis.
Sure. As Chris mentioned, we're focusing primarily in this webinar on bills that seem to have legs so far this session. So for those of you who maybe are only able to tune in for the first few minutes and then have to jump, although I hope you'll come back and rewatch later, here's just kind of a high level summary of some of the bills that we plan to get into in more detail. So House Bill 1, Senate Bill 1, the appropriations bill. For purposes of this webinar, we're focused on an increase in the Texas Energy Fund budget as discussed in that bill. In the Senate version of the bill, there would be a $5 billion appropriation in additional dollars from the General Revenue Fund to the Public Utility Commission, or the PUC, for Texas Energy Fund grants and loans toward dispatchable electric generation facilities. Forgive me and forgive all of us as we slip into acronyms. A lot of you know this industry as alphabet soup, so very quickly Texas Energy Fund is going to become TEF or TEF. Just roll with me, please. The House committee substitute for Senate Bill 1 appropriates only $2 billion for the Texas Energy Fund, so there is a difference there. Senate Bill 6, large load interconnection. As Holly said, this has been a very hot topic issue this session, large load concepts generally. I won't get too into the weeds now because I don't want to steal all of Holly's thunder. She'll be talking more about SB 6. But this bill kind of generally discusses interconnection and cost considerations, planning requirements for large load interconnections, including upfront proof of financial commitment, PUC net metering approval for existing generation co-locating with new large load, curtailment requirements, and creation of a reliability service for demand reduction during emergency events. SB 819, we're calling this now determination of public interest for wind and solar, but I think many of you would be familiar with this conceptually as the PUC permitting bill for wind and solar projects. This finding would be required for projects in size of 10 megawatts or greater connected to transmission facilities. It includes considerations such as setback requirements. It has public notice requirements. And there are also national security considerations that are folded into this determination. Senate Bill 388, goal for 50% dispatchable generation in ERCOT by January 1, 2026. Notably, we'll just flag for you that this excludes battery storage and would require creation of a dispatchable generation credits training program. Moving on to House Bill 14 and its compatriots there. Nuclear Development Fund. So the intent of this legislation would be to promote development of advanced nuclear reactor projects for dispatchable electric generation. And then finally, our last high-level discussion is Senate Bill 2268 and House Bill 4632, which would extend the deadline for disbursement of TEF in ERCOT loan funds beyond December 31st, 2025, which is the current statutory deadline. And these disbursements can be extended at the PUC's discretion on a case-by-case basis based upon certain findings, and we'll discuss that further on in the webinar.
Okay, thanks. So I think next we're going to talk a little bit more about the budget or the TEF allocation, perhaps.
Yes. So the TEF portion of the appropriations bill, Senate Bill 1, just so have a frame of reference for status, was voted out of the House and Senate committees as of April 15th, and the House granted a request for conference committee on the 15th. So as Chris referenced earlier, there is a discrepancy still between the two versions of the budget bill that have been passed from each House. So during the 88th Texas Legislative Session, our legislature created the Texas Energy Fund to establish out of ERCOT grants for certain transmission and distribution infrastructure and electric generation purposes, including modernization, weatherization, reliability, and resiliency functions, low interest loans for in ERCOT new or upgraded dispatchable generation projects, which add at least 100 megawatts available to the ERCOT wholesale markets, and completion bonus grants for construction of new dispatchable generation, again, of at least 100 megawatts. And then finally, backup power packages. The program is administered by the PUCT, and initial restrictions on use of the fund from the original version of the legislation last session were that the total funds that the PUC could provide for all of these programs was $10 billion. The allocation for that was $1 billion for out of ERCOT grants, $7.2 billion for in ERCOT loans and completion bonus grants, and $1.8 billion for backup power packages. $5 billion was appropriated for TEF programs last session. So the appropriations bill this time around for Senate Bill 1 would appropriate the remaining $5 billion. And the House version would appropriate only $2 billion of the remaining $5 billion.
Okay, thanks. So I think, Holly, you're going to now turn to the important subject of large load interconnection.
Yeah, absolutely. So the most important bill, relating to large load interconnection right now is SB 6. That's kind of the omnibus large load bill that's up this session. As you can see, a super low bill number, which indicates it's a priority for state leadership. And there are a few different things going on in Senate Bill 6. One is that a large load that's subject to the planning requirements in the bill, which is a new large load or a large load that expands its size, has to contribute to recovery of the interconnecting electric utilities costs to interconnect to that utility system. There are also a lot of new interconnection requirements for large loads, including a 100K study fee, certain financial assurance requirements, a requirement that the large load has to disclose substantially similar interconnection requests that it's pursuing with other utilities, whether that's utilities here in Texas, or maybe utilities, elsewhere in the United States or even in other countries, with the idea there being that helps, ERCOT and the transmission service providers plan better, and that they'll have a better understanding of how serious these large loads may be, and whether they're pursuing interconnection requests that might cause them to drop the one that they've submitted to that interconnecting utility if another interconnection request gets approved. You also see a requirement for the PUC to approve a net metering arrangement between a new large load and an existing generator. Notably, that doesn't apply where there's an arrangement between a new large load and a new generator. And I think the idea there is for the PUC to have some oversight and that tool is kind of in place to kind of try to prevent existing generation from potentially exiting the grid. Notably, the PUC has 180 days to approve those arrangements. And if it doesn't approve it, it's considered automatically, or if it doesn't approve or deny, if it doesn't take action, it's considered automatically approved. But in that space of time, the PUC can impose conditions on that net metering arrangement. And one of them is that during certain times of scarcity and reliability issues, that large load can be required to reduce its load. The generator can, be required to offer into the grid, make itself available to the grid. So those are some conditions that the PUC can put on those net metering arrangements. There's also curtailment requirements and certain requirements to install equipment so that load shed can be effectuated with those new large loads and expanded large loads. There's a provision to establish a new ERCOT reliability service to procure demand reductions from large loads of 75 megawatts or greater. And then very importantly, the PUC is directed to reevaluate 4CP transmission cost allocation. So that's going to be major. In an earlier version of the bill, the PUC was given the option to decide if it wanted to amend the rules on 4CP transmission cost allocation, but that's not the case in this newer version of the bill. The PUC is definitely going to be reevaluating that. It's definitely going to pass some kind of rule around that. It just remains to be seen what that will be.
So Senate Bill 6 obviously is to address this explosive load growth that ERCOT and TSPs and just about everybody else seems to be predicting. What are some of the more specific concerns that this bill is seeking to get into as far as how it's structured and its specific requirements?
There's a few different concerns I think this is intended to address. One, I think there's a feeling that there needs to be an overall 4CP review to maybe address some cost shifting that might be going on with customers, that have the ability to avoid those 4 coincident peaks. I think there's a view in the legislature that there should be more transparency in the planning and the interconnection of large loads. And I think it's also an effort to make sure that existing generation doesn't exit the system in order to serve these new and expanded large load customers. One of the things that, Vice Chair King, who's the Vice Chair of the Senate Business and Commerce Committee and the author of the bill, was saying it was that he wants, large loads to know that Texas is open for business. We want large loads here. He's saying the state is friendly to them. But he also said he doesn't want to see a Storm Uri type situation where, residential customers are out of power and maybe, some of these, large loads and commercial customers are still on. So I think that's a big part of what he's trying to address with this bill and what the state leadership is trying to address.
Okay, thanks.
Turning to some other large load bills to watch. There are, we'll just kind of pass over this slide, and Chris, if you want to bring us over to that one. We'll just kind of pass over this. This is here mostly, for your interest, but I do want to flag in particular House Bill 3970, I think is really interesting. That requires ERCOT to develop an expedited large load interconnection process for large loads, 75 megawatts and greater. That's the key number we keep seeing in legislation for defining a large load, that agree to cease consuming grid power through deployment of behind the meter generation when ERCOT directs them to do so. So that's something where I think shortly we're expecting a committee substitute, which has been talked about in hearings. And I think that's a really interesting bill that allows large loads to opt into this curtailment process in exchange for getting expedited large load interconnection.
Okay, great. So not everything is large loads. A lot of it's renewables. So Elena, can you start discussing those bills?
Well, I'm actually going to punt to Holly on this one.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
But we will change over midway through.
We will.
Yeah.
So Senate Bill 819 is probably one of the most significant of the bills regulating renewables that's out there right now. That bill would apply to new wind and solar generation facilities, 10 megawatts and greater. And they would be required to file an application for a determination of public interest with the PUC. So before this was a permitting requirement. In an early version of the bill, they had to obtain a permit from the commission. Now it's a determination of public interest. And so similar to the net metering arrangement situation, SB6, the PUC has 180 days to approve or deny one of these applications. If there's no decision, it's approved. And there are some parameters around this decision by the commission. They can only deny an application if the application requirements are not met, so sort of more of a procedural issue, or if the PUC makes a determination that the potential harm caused by the construction and interconnection substantially outweighs the potential benefit to the state. There are also some setback requirements in here, which apply unless the facility gets waivers from the neighboring landowners. For a new solar facility, that setback is going to be 100 feet from a bordering property line, 200 feet from a habitable structure. For wind, the bill has been through a few different iterations of distance requirements. The current one added on the Senate floor is that the distance of the facility has to be at least twice the height of the wind turbine, including the blades, from the property line. One interesting thing that we've talked about a little with our FERC team here at Husch Blackwell is that while the bill in its current form could be construed to apply to the regions of Texas that are outside ERCOT as well as in ERCOT, there may be some FERC preemption issues if there's an effort to try to apply them outside of ERCOT due to FERC's open access regulations and policies. But our FERC team also noted that, you know, the current FERC chairman is very state policy friendly, and he might instead read this to be more of a permit type requirement and not something that is directly preempted by federal regulations. So that's something interesting and something to watch and see if they change this and narrow it as the bill moves through the process in the House.
So as I think suggested a little bit earlier, we get lots and lots of calls, and probably the number one is Senate Bill 819 going to pass? So is Senate Bill 819 going to pass?
Well,
I think, you know, this is not the first time we've seen a version of this bill. There was also a PUC type permitting bill specific for renewables last session also, which made it fairly far through the process before ultimately falling out. And now we've seen it again. It's kind of, there's a resurgence this time around at this session. And so I think what we're noticing is that there seems to be some momentum behind the bill, certainly. And there seem to be some strong political forces behind it. And it wouldn't be shocking if some version of it were ultimately passed through the very end. But as Chris noted, we're only slightly halfway through session at this point. There's a lot still to be done. There are more committee meetings to be held. There's always the possibility of amendments from the floor. So no one likes this answer, but TBD.
Okay, well, thanks. I am noticing many questions in our question function on Senate Bill 819, so we'll return to that. But if we can make a little more headway, we're almost halfway through our webinar, so let's move on to Senate Bill 715.
so that is, you know, we refer to this as a firming bill. Basically, it requires an electric generation facility to demonstrate the ability to comply with certain reliability requirements, and basically the ability to dispatch power during, you know, certain periods of reliability risk. As soon as the facility has been in operation for at least a year. So that's what the bill would change. The current timeline, rather than being in operation for at least a year, is that those requirements would apply only to a generation facility that executed an interconnection agreement on or after January 1st, 2027. So this is a bill that has a big impact on renewables and intermittent renewables in particular, because of that dispatchability component. There is a committee substitute, and we're keeping an eye out for this to be, you know, posted on Texas Legislature online. So at the moment, I'm just going to give you the overview as the author described it in committee. But the bill author said the committee substitute, which has been approved, basically has the following changes. One, a generator is exempt from a penalty if it can dispatch continuously for at least 24 hours. Two, wind and solar can avoid penalty by obtaining, you know, sufficient energy storage or backup power to meet that 24-hour dispatchability requirement. And 3, the PUC is directed to phase in penalties and incentives. Before, those penalties might have been, an immediate part of the rule, but now the PUC is specifically directed to phase them in and to give generators more time.
Okay.
Next, we're going to talk a little bit about battery bills. So Senate Bill 1824, House Bill 3809. Of the two, the House bill is the one that's moving. And this legislation generally relates to the removal of battery energy storage facilities, or BESS facilities. It would apply to transmission and distribution interconnected batteries that participate in the ERCOT wholesale markets. So it would exclude self-generators. And which are co-located with wind and solar facilities and share a point of interconnection with those facilities. It requires a lease agreement that authorizes a lessor operating a battery energy storage facility to provide that the lessee or grantee is responsible for removing the BESS facility from the landowner's property, and to comply with certain clearing, cleaning, and removal requirements for the BESS facility, down even to specifying the requirement to fill the cavity created in the hole by the battery, and the ways in which it's acceptable to do that. It would require that these agreements also specify that the grantee is responsible for collecting, reusing, or recycling, or shipping for such purposes all components of the BESS facility that can be reused or recycled, and properly disposing of the components that cannot be reused or recycled. Finally, the agreement must provide that the grantee will obtain and deliver to the landowner financial assurance to secure performance of these obligations, such as a parent guarantee, a letter of credit, or a bond. Senate Bill 1825 and House Bill 3824. The House bill is the one that's moving for this set of bills. It applies to battery operators, which include electric cooperatives, electric utilities, or power generation companies that own or operate battery storage inside or outside of ERCOT. In addition to some of the points that are up here on the slide, which is that it would establish fire safety standards for battery energy storage resources, it has requirements about local fire safety standards, and development of site-specific emergency plans. I want to note that this proposed legislation that imposes this emergency operations plan requirement on owners of battery energy storage systems is separate and apart from the existing emergency operations plan requirements of the Public Utility Commission, which already apply to power generation companies, and batteries are power generation companies. So just something to note, that this legislation seems to impose an additional emergency operations plan requirement that has to be provided to local first responders, which is a different requirement, as I mentioned, from what's in the current PUC emergency operations plan rules. Lastly, this legislation applies to batteries approved for interconnection by the applicable ISO on or after January 1, 2027.
And I'll just jump in and say, it's my understanding that on both of these safety bills, those were largely agreed or even supported by the storage interests, maybe even, sponsored by or with drafting assistance by. So these are kind of consensus pieces of legislation as opposed to some of the others we're talking about.
House Bill 3228 and Senate Bill 2657. This applies to lease agreements between a grantee and a landowner that authorize the grantee to operate a wind power facility or solar power facility on the leased property. So very similar to the prior bill on recycling and disposal that I mentioned previously. This is very, very substantially similar, except that it applies to wind and solar facilities as opposed to the battery version of this bill. House Bill 3229, Senate Bill 2659. This one would require the owner of a recycling facility that accepts, processes, and repurposes materials from wind turbine generators, solar energy devices, and battery storage systems to submit an annual report to TCEQ and provide certain financial assurance. And it also subjects non-compliance with these requirements to an administrative penalty of up to $500 per day for failure to comply.
Well, at least it's not the 25,000 per day if you're a wholesale market miscreant.
Well, $1 million per day if it's a weatherization specific issue.
Right.
So on our next slide, we have just a couple of additional renewable bills to watch. We're not going to go as in-depth into these because they've not been really moving in the same way that some of the others have. I will note on SB 714, House Bill 3374, I know that this bill got, I think, a lot of attention early in session when it was initially filed. I know we certainly got some questions about it, which would require the PUC and ERCOT to eliminate or compensate for any distortion in electric utility pricing caused by federal tax credits, renewable federal energy tax credits. I just want to note that neither of these bills have moved out of their respective committees since March. There haven't been any hearings on them. We said before, anything's possible, but this certainly has not been as high priority as some of the other bills that have really been moving, like the large load bill and a few others we're discussing here today. And then House Bill 912 provides that the current process for determining compensation for a DER generation owner outside of ERCOT remains in effect unless the PUC approves a different compensation method. And then House Bill 3278, requiring the PUC, TCEQ, and Texas Parks and Wildlife to study the effects of solar and wind generation facilities on the environment, economy, and infrastructure in Texas, and imposes a moratorium on wind or solar projects from receiving state economic incentives, including tax.
Yeah, to Elena's point, just because the bill hadn't been moving for 139 days of the session doesn't mean it's absolutely dead. 10:30 at night on 5 days before the end of the session, the sponsor of one of these bills can head to the back mic and move for adoption of Floor Amendment 1, which is essentially a bill that's been languishing, and that's how you get your bill passed sometimes. So these things can be like vampires in a way. They're not dead until they're absolutely positively dead. Anyway, just additional point for everybody to keep in mind. But not all is bad news. Speaking of which.
Okay, Senate Bill 2321. This one was just voted out of the Senate Business and Commerce Committee on the 16th and received by the Senate just yesterday. So recent movement on this one. Requires TCEQ to waive enforcement of emissions limits, operational hour restrictions, and similar standards for generation and backup generation facilities during periods when ERCOT notifies TCEQ that electric demand or grid reliability needs cannot be met. Owners or operators of affected facilities must still take commercially reasonable steps to minimize excess emissions and maintain operational records and submit certain documentation to TCEQ. And TCEQ cannot take enforcement action on emissions exceedances during these periods if the required documentation is submitted. Some examples of that documentation are that the generation owner would have to provide the facility's name and contact information, the county where it's located, the TCEQ issued customer reference number, the name of any units at the facility that did exceed an emissions limit or standard during that period, and a description of the emissions event. So I think it's worth noting for this one that you're not exempt from enforcement if you don't submit the required documentation.
Okay.
And now Senate Bill 2268, House Bill 4632. This is the bill that I prefaced earlier in our key bills that would allow the PUC to disperse initial TEF fund loans after December 31st, 2025, if the PUC determines market factors necessitate a deadline extension for the disbursement of those funds. And applicants can request disbursement after the December 31st, 2025 deadline. and PUC again approves those on a case-by-case basis.
So Elena, on the Texas Energy Fund, I mean, a lot of attention to applicants kind of dropping out of the process, some more noisily than others. Is this bill or these two bills kind of intended to, I don't know, fine tune the program to address some of those concerns, or is this coming from a different place?
I think that's right. I think the fact that some applicants have fallen out of the due diligence process is very relevant to this proposed legislation. To recap a little bit on TEF, so when the Texas Energy Fund was originally implemented, the legislature imposed certain guardrails on TEF in ERCOT loan eligibility, including that a facility can only qualify if it did not meet the planning model requirements necessary to be included in the ERCOT CDR before June 1st, 2023. And I think that was because the intent of the original TEF bill was to really incentivize new steel on the ground, new dispatchable steel on the ground. So the prior legislation also, as we see, set a deadline of December 31st, 2025 for initial loan disbursements for any of the projects that were allowed to proceed through the program. Back in August of 2024, the commission approved 17 proposed dispatchable generation projects to proceed to due diligence. And that represented almost 10,000 megawatts and over $5 billion in requested funds. And then the commission delegated authority to the PUC's executive director to execute loan applications with the projects that did successfully complete due diligence. As we've seen over the last several months, almost half of the originally approved applicants have either dropped out or been kicked out in some cases from the current due diligence process.
Kicked out is such an ugly phrase. Invited to pursue alternative sources of funding, maybe.
Sure, absolutely. But of the projects that did voluntarily withdraw, we have seen that more than one, maybe more than two or three even, have cited supply chain issues and a difficulty being able to achieve the milestone deadlines that would be required to meet that December 31st initial loan disbursement deadline. So we're potentially seeing viable projects dropping out of eligibility just because they can't meet the current construction deadline requirements. And so I think this would allow an opportunity on a case-by-case basis at the commission's discretion to prolong that period and keep some of these projects in.
Thanks for that. We have a question on nuclear funding that I think the next bill is going to pick up. So we'll handle that question this way.
Sounds great. You know, we've seen a lot of bills filed this session on advanced nuclear development. So House Bill 14, SB 2060, and then a related constitutional amendment, HJR 8. So HB 14, SB 2060 would establish the Texas Advanced Nuclear Development Fund to support advanced nuclear reactor projects with reimbursement-based grants. It would also create a Texas Advanced Nuclear Energy Office to take on tasks like providing strategic leadership, collaborating with stakeholders, doing public outreach, and just in general promoting advanced nuclear generation development in Texas. And those bills further establish that the PUC can use some of the Texas Energy Fund funding to provide completion grants for an advanced nuclear reactor project that is capable of interconnection with the ERCOT grid. And then relatedly, we can flip to the next slide, and HJR 8 is again that constitutional amendment that establishes this Texas Nuclear Development Fund outside of the General Revenue Fund. And that fund is specifically intended to support development of advanced nuclear projects. It can be used to fund grants for financing and incentivizing those projects.
Okay.
Also worth noting is SB 388. And that sets a goal of 50%, that 50% of generating capacity in ERCOT after January 1st, 2026 must be from dispatchable generation sources other than battery storage. And if that goal is not on track to be met, then the PUC is required to activate a dispatchable generation credits trading program by January of 2027. and specifically if the PUC determines that dispatchable generation may provide less than 55% of all new generating capacity installed in ERCOT after January 1st, 2026.
So that's like an ongoing year by year look, right?
Yeah, they're looking to see, like, is this goal going to be met, or
So your credit amount might vary from year to year, or your quantum of dispatchable that backs you up might vary from year to year as well.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
And then turning to SB 2021, so that's a bill that applies to distributed energy resources, and they'd either be required to register as a power generation company with the PUC if they want to sell energy and ancillary services at wholesale and ERCOT, or they'd have to be part of an aggregated distributed energy resource that is already included in a PGC registration. This bill also requires the PUC to establish rules governing, DER interconnection, integration, and cost recovery, and requires ERCOT to adopt requirements to integrate these distributed energy resources into their settlement processes.
Good luck with that.
And then we've got some additional generation bills to watch, but just in the interest of time, I think we can move past these. And if folks are interested in these, these are available on our slides.
Yeah, these would be bills I assume that really haven't been moving, but are of note that
And some of them have been moving, but I think we've chosen to focus on sometimes ones that are more significant. Maybe
they're not as cool as the ones that we're talking about. Got it.
They can't sit with
us. Transmission is a thing still. Who knew?
Indeed it is. And it's a big topic of conversation right now with respect to the Permian Basin. So House Bill 2152 and SB 391 would require the PUC to direct ERCOT to update the Permian Basin Reliability Plan every 5 years. This expounds upon a bill from last session, which was House Bill 5066, which required the PUC to direct ERCOT to develop a reliability plan for the Permian Basin. And that reliability plan was to address extending transmission service to areas where mineral resources have been found, to address increasing available capacity to meet forecasted load, and to provide available infrastructure to reduce interconnection times in areas without access to transmission service. So this just is an ongoing kind of update to that plan every 5 years.
And so, like you said, last session, they were very explicit about not only, having a plan to provide more transmission in the Permian Basin, but hey, you can do plans for other transmission deficient areas as well. What's been happening in the Permian that kind of leads to this bill to reinforce that directive?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to answer that as part of explaining what's been going on at the PUC. So the PUC and ERCOT since last session have been very hard at work on the Permian Basin Reliability Plan. The commission issued an order approving a reliability plan back in October of 2024. If anyone's interested in going back and reviewing that project, it's 55718 at the PUC. And it reflects ERCOT's assessment of transmission needs in the Permian Basin, which is based on load forecast information provided by the transmission service providers, showing that by 2030, TSPs anticipate approximately 23,659 megawatts of load in the Permian Basin region. And by 2038, they anticipate a total projected demand of approximately 26,400 megawatts. And so this reliability plan currently consists of new and upgraded 138 kV and 345 kV transmission lines and substations. The plan provided for import paths that consist of 345 kV and 765 kV transmission line options that would increase access to available generation capacity to meet those growing electricity needs. I'll note that kind of in tandem with this Permian Basin Reliability Plan, the Commission is also considering the option of building 765 kV within ERCOT on a statewide basis. And I believe that's still an ongoing discussion at the PUC in consideration of various factors like supply chain issues and cost comparisons. I'll note that if anyone is particularly interested in this issue, PUC staff, I think just yesterday maybe, filed a memo and project number 55718 that makes a recommendation actually that the commission approve the 765 kV import paths, and provides a very comprehensive overview of the workshops that have been had to date, all of the factors that have been discussed and considered. So it's item number 106, if anyone wants to take a look at that.
Following these 765 kV cost estimates is like following natural gas prices. They tend to oscillate like up and down like gas prices or spot market oil prices. I've noticed.
Well, and there's no frame of reference for it in ERCOT, right?
Yeah.
We're having to look, at examples in other parts of the country. So
anyway, if you're developing a data center, you may want to put it in the Permian Basin because we know they're going to get some transmission soon. Okay, let's move on.
House Bill 3069. So this would modify the existing statutory CCN considerations in PURA to add more criteria.
There's not enough criteria as it is.
Yes.
You go to CCN cases and you see the table that's got like 37 different criteria. So we definitely need more.
Well, here's another one. And it's the PUC would have to establish supplemental multi-decade transmission planning criteria for granting a CCN for a transmission project that serves the ERCOT region, and is not necessary to meet state or federal reliability standards. Notably, this only applies to a CCN proceeding that commences on or after September 1, 2026. So I don't know, get your applications in now, maybe.
It's going to take me that long to figure out how to say that term.
All right, Senate Bill 1789, which would amend PURA Section 36402 regarding recovery of system restoration costs incurred by an electric utility in connection with restoration of service and infrastructure due to power outages affecting the utility's customers from a weather-related event or a natural disaster occurring after 2008. The bill would allow the PUC to reduce the utility's return on equity for infrastructure used or installed to repair or replace a damaged portion of the system if the utility fails to comply with new structural integrity standards for transmission and distribution poles that are also introduced by this bill, and if the utility is damaged by a weather-related event or natural disaster. It would establish new PURA 38.006, which are the structural integrity standards. And that includes an annual reporting requirement also for utilities, MOUs, and co-ops. And finally, the bill would amend the current SAIDI safety standards. I'm going to spare all of you and not get into what SAIDI safety standards are or how they're enforced at the PUC, because I think that's interesting to this many people. Sorry.
Jim Hecker in our DC office would love to talk to you for hours on SAIDI and safety. So everybody call Jim in our DC office.
And I think that's all I had for 1789.
Is this the Hurricane Barrel bill, pretty much?
It's one of
certain. Yeah, there's another one I think that maybe is a little bit on point, but yes, I think this certainly could also.
Well, everybody make sure to download your Whataburger app. That's all I can say.
Finally, a few other electric utility bills to watch, which we won't, get into too much depth right now. Submission by electric utilities of plans to the PUC every 3 years for management and inspection of transmission and distribution poles. Self-insurance by electric utilities for wildfire damage. I know that there's been a lot of discussion. There's been an attempt for a lot of discussion, I think, at the PUC by utilities on insurance premiums related to fire protection. That's been a big issue in the last year or so, that at least that I've noticed. House Bill 1584, providing that hospitals, police stations, fire stations, water, wastewater facilities, and certain criminal justice facilities are priority facilities for electric service, and requiring electric utilities to maintain a list of priority facilities and a priority facility request process, although I expect a lot of them probably do that already. And then House Bill 3157, allowing electric utilities to implement interim rates during a rate suspension period with 45 days advance notice to retail electric providers.
And we've got a few more, electric utility bills to watch here, related to rate transparency requirements, capacity costs that a non-ERCOT utility might incur by participating in a multi-state auction, some limitations, removal of the limitation to allow ERCOT and non-ERCOT utilities to recover certain system restoration costs. We'll just kind of pass over these because we want to make sure that we've got time for your questions at the end. And if we can go to the next slide, we've got one more. Just a quick transmission bill to watch that would change the transmission line CCN requirement for a load interconnection from 3 miles to 5 miles. But with that, we'd like to turn to any questions that people may have.
Yeah. Okay. So
We've got one more slide.
Okay. That's important.
Yeah.
So we've got more questions than we have time for. Happy to go a little past the 1 o'clock, 1 o'clock penciled in deadline for those who want to stick around. But if we, for whatever questions we don't get to here in these next few minutes, we'll try and email you back, which, won't be able to allow everybody else to hear the answer, but at least the questioner can get it. Let me take this first one and just paraphrasing, anything happening on water resources, and are we reviewing those? We haven't really been following water legislation too much, but I will say the Senate just adopted a comprehensive set of pieces of water resources legislation that's primarily known as Senate Bill 7, designed to create some procedures and create some new authority to stimulate the growth of additional water resources. Also, there's a constitutional amendment that goes along with that, which is House Joint Resolution 7, which would authorize $1 billion to the Texas Water Fund to develop more projects. If state leadership's goal is we want to have expansion of dispatchable capacity, well, that's gas, and that's got to have some water resources associated with that in a state that, A, has fires breaking out every summer, and B, has subdivisions expanding across the map that all need water too. So certainly agree with the sentiment of this questioner that water is going to be critical to, kind of all the plans that we're seeing coming out of the legislature, and there is activity on that front. We talked about the nuclear development funding issue. Large loads. It is not clear how impactful or material these new rules, costs, fees will be for large loads. Is the impetus to slow down large load growth?
I think Vice Chair King indicated he does want Texas to be, open for business to large loads. I think what the study fee is intended to do, and I think there's a lot of discussion about whether it's actually high enough to do that, is to weed out projects that are speculative, non-serious, that might not have a lot of money behind them. So that's the intent, but I think what you're getting at is important, that there's a lot of discussion that maybe 100K is too low.
Right, to have a more orderly process and focus on, the more realistic projects and not shadow projects or speculative and reserve costs for those projects. Okay, got it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Senate Bill 819, what is classified as a new generation facility is, and there's a couple other questions along these lines. Is it, shovel ready or broken ground, or is it an actual interconnection request or ERCOT? What is new generation to which the bill would apply?
I believe that's tied to interconnecting. That's something, we could follow up on, but I believe the language basically ties it to interconnection.
The language in the bill says that before you may interconnect to a transmission facility, you must obtain this, permit that's not really a permit, but kind of is a permit. And so that's another one of those that, unless it gets amended further, PUC would decide. What does that mean exactly? Does it literally mean that you can go right up to the time when you, hook up that interconnection line? Or does it mean we're not going to allow TDSPs to even mess with interconnection applications for somebody that hasn't even gotten this determination yet? So not crystal clear, but the literal wording would be, if you have not interconnected, then this bill would apply after the effective date.
And it also applies to expansions. I believe that's 5 megawatts or greater of a load expansion. So it would apply, say, if you're going back to ERCOT and doing a generator interconnection or modification, doing that modification, that expansion of capacity could be that trigger.
Another Senate Bill 819 question. It's like people are concerned about this. Does it have any restrictions for BESS?
No, the Senate Bill 819 does not apply to batteries. And that's something I thought was really interesting in some of the public testimony. So, public testimony was overwhelmingly against this bill. Most of the people who testified opposed this bill. I believe it was 103 signed up against, 19 signed up for. But of the people who signed up to testify in favor of SB 819, there were a number who said that they felt that this bill should pass because they were worried about battery fires in their communities. And they said, we don't have sufficient evacuation routes. We don't have enough of a volunteer firefighting force to deal with battery fires. And that is a really odd thing because Senate Bill 819 has nothing to do with batteries. It does not regulate them.
Okay, let's skip to another bill, Senate Bill 715. And the question, paraphrasing, is, was the 24 hours requirement, was that the result of some sort of technical justification, some sort of evidence that 24 hours is the necessary runtime, or was that just somebody just pulled that number from somewhere else?
My understanding of hearing the author, explain it in the committee hearing, describing the committee substitute, was that that was basically included because there was concern that the existing bill would impact existing dispatchable generators, and this was designed to make sure it didn't have that negative impact on them. Beyond that, the lobbying, we're not deep into that, but that was how the author explained it in the committee hearing.
Sometimes it's like buying a car. You've got your number and they've got their number, and the real number is the one that's somewhere in between. Okay, House Bill 3229 is non-compliance related to not filing the annual report or failing to recycle. So I guess that's one of the battery recycling or wind recycling bills.
Yeah, my understanding is that, and I would have to go back and double check this specifically in the bill, but I don't think that it's necessarily tied to the report. I think it's for the underlying obligation.
It's the doing of it's the performing of the obligation.
I think that that's correct, but I would have to go back and double check that.
But I mean, they're going to zap you if you don't file a report.
I mean, sure.
Everybody out there needs to realize that if there's a report requirement, you got to file a report, or that is its own potential violation. Senate Bill 1824, I think that's what, battery safety. Recycling. Who is responsible for decommissioning costs that does not impact the ratepayer? I guess the question is, who's responsible for the decommissioning costs associated with that?
The way that I've read that is that it would be the owner of the battery energy storage facility.
Question about... Sorry, I'm kind of reading these questions on the fly here. Okay. We addressed the most recent question about what do you mean by interconnect by September 1, 2025? Well, to be seen, not crystal clear. Okay, I guess this is a good last question to leave with. What are the 3 bills that pro and anti-renewables people aren't pro or anti-renewables, they're just people, should be focused on? So I guess let me try and reframe the question. What are the 3 most important renewables bills, one way or the other?
Definitely SB 819. I think that would be like top of my list at this point. Be the next most important out of all the ones we've talked about.
I mean, I think SB 6 is still important to renewable resources. even though it directly is regulating large load interconnections. As we know, co-location of renewable generation and large load is proliferating. And there are renewable facilities in ERCOT that are kind of stranded behind a constraint, and they are looking for a viable kind of long-term offtake solution. And that a lot of times is going to mean co-locating with large load. And so the requirements that are applicable to large load interconnections may in some ways end up being relevant also to the renewable facilities that they co-locate with for financial or commercial reasons.
I think that's a great point. Don't you think that most of what we see here, I mean, most as in 50% plus 0.1, is not simply solar by itself, but solar plus some sort of data center or some sort of co-located load, or at least they want that optionality. I mean, it's sort of like that's the next investment opportunity for renewables, or the surest investment opportunity for renewables, at least in Texas, having a co-located load and not having to fuss quite as much with what's happening out there in the ERCOT system.
I mean, I think it's certainly true. We've seen a massive uptick in terms of the M&A deals that we're doing right now for ERCOT projects. ERCOT renewable projects are co-located load and wind or solar projects. And to your point, even where the initial configuration doesn't contemplate that there would be a co-located load, a lot of people do want the optionality. So we're getting a lot of questions on the front end about, well, maybe it's a merchant project in the first instance, but downstream, if we do want to bring in a data center or something, what are some considerations that we need to make now?
Or data center calls us and says, how do we install 200 megawatts of solar and make that happen? I'll nominate the third bill as Senate Bill 715, the firming bill that Holly discussed. So the firming requirement was in House Bill 1500. It is in the law, but it only applies prospectively, and it only applies starting in 2027. Senate Bill 715 would just say, grandfathering terminated. Everybody's got to be responsible for this. And, all of you people who put in all of this capacity that is bailing us out every summer, well, guess what? You now are responsible for firming requirements. And so, and those firming requirements are potentially highly costly, depending upon things like, studies of what the embedded costs are and so forth. So, and I think that's a key one as well. Okay, there you go. So we didn't quite get to all the questions, but as to those that we didn't, hopefully we at least dealt them a glancing blow. Thank you so much for attending. I want to express my appreciation to my colleagues, my compatriots, as Elena said earlier, for their great review of where we are in the session. And just remind everybody, we're nowhere near done yet. All of this can turn on a dime, so keep after it. Contact your state reps, your state senators. Every little bit helps. And don't think that just because you're not the biggest kid on the block, that you cannot affect the process in a way that is going to help protect your interests in this industry. So just a reminder, the program's been approved for legal education hours, and if you want to report that, you can click on the CEU icon. The certificate of attendance with course numbers will be emailed to you tomorrow along with a recording. And then please complete our surveys. We want to make sure that our programming and our content is what people are interested in actually hearing about. And so we use those surveys to do that. So we are done. Everybody have a great rest of the day and weekend. And if you celebrate the holiday, hope that you have a great holiday as well. Thanks very much.